Beneath the sand, there was a liquid that could move armies, build cities, protect monarchies, shake currencies, and decide how much a family pays to drive to work on the other side of the planet. For centuries, the Middle East was mapped by empires, deserts, trade routes, holy cities, tribes, ports, and borders drawn by foreign powers. But in the 20th century, another map began to appear, one that was not printed in schoolbooks. It was a map of wells, pipelines, refineries, tankers, concessions, military bases, shipping lanes, and narrow straits where a local crisis could become a global shock. Oil did not simply make some countries rich. It changed what those countries meant to the world. It transformed small Gulf monarchies into financial powers, turned foreign companies into geopolitical actors, made energy security a matter of national survival, and placed places like the Strait of Hormuz at the center of the global economy. OPEC itself was born in Baghdad in 1960, when producing states began trying to reclaim influence over a system long dominated by outside companies and consuming powers. The visible story is oil. The hidden story is dependence. Because whoever controls energy does not only control fuel, they influence prices, alliances, wars, development, technology, and the rhythm of modern life. And that is why the real question is not just how much oil the Middle East has. The real question is how oil redrew the region's map of power, and why the rest of the world still lives inside that map. Before we begin, if you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our world, subscribe to Hidden Power Map. And if this episode helps you see the world differently, leave a like. When most people look at the modern Middle East, they see the visible surface first. They see royal families in the Gulf, skyscrapers rising out of the desert, luxury airlines crossing continents, military bases near strategic waters, conflicts that dominate headlines, and sudden changes in the price of gasoline after a crisis thousands of kilometers away. They see meetings between presidents and kings, sanctions against oil-producing states, wars near energy corridors, and investors watching the region every time tension rises around the Persian Gulf. At first glance, the story seems familiar. The Middle East appears to be a region shaped by borders, religion, dynasties, revolutions, foreign intervention, and regional rivalry, and all of those forces matter. No serious map of the region can ignore them. But there is another layer beneath them, a layer that does not always appear in speeches or flags or official maps. It is the layer of energy. Not energy as an abstract idea, but energy as barrels, fields, pipelines, ports, tankers, refineries, contracts, and naval protection. The modern world often speaks about the Middle East as if its importance were inevitable. But it was not always seen this way. Before oil became the blood of industrial civilization, many of the territories that would later become central to global strategy were not the main prize of world politics. They mattered, but differently. They mattered for trade routes, imperial access, religious significance, regional influence, and proximity to empires. Then oil changed the scale of everything. It did not erase older histories. It attached them to a new engine. Once oil became essential to armies, factories, cars, airplanes, shipping, petrochemicals, electricity systems, and mass consumption, the ground beneath the Middle East acquired a new meaning. A desert was no longer just a desert. A coastline was no longer just a coastline. A narrow waterway was no longer just a passage. A monarchy was no longer only a local political order. It could become a guardian of reserves that industrial powers needed to keep their economies alive. This is the visible paradox of the oil age. Some countries with relatively small populations became globally important because of what lay under their territory. States that had once depended on outside protection or limited local revenues suddenly gained the financial capacity to build roads, ports, cities, airlines, sovereign wealth funds, and international influence. At the same time, their wealth made them more exposed. The more valuable their oil became, the more attention they attracted from companies, empires, rival states, armies, and markets. That is why the story of oil in the Middle East cannot be reduced to a simple story of wealth. Wealth is only the surface. Beneath it is dependency. Producing countries depended on oil revenues to build modern states. Consuming countries depended on oil imports to fuel their economies. Foreign companies depended on concessions and access. Militaries depended on secure supply. Consumers depended on stable prices without knowing how fragile the system could be. And the global economy depended on the assumption that oil would keep moving every day across seas, through chokepoints, and into refineries. This dependency created a strange form of power. The countries that owned the oil did not automatically control the entire system. For decades, outside companies controlled much of the technology, finance, transport, and pricing. The countries that consumed the oil did not own the reserves, but they controlled markets, navies, currencies, and diplomatic pressure. Between them emerged a tense bargain. Producers needed buyers, buyers needed supply, and both sides needed the routes to remain open. The public often notices this system only when something goes wrong. A war begins. A tanker is attacked. A pipeline is disrupted. A revolution threatens production. A government announces an embargo. A cartel changes output. Suddenly, oil prices move, inflation fears rise, airlines adjust costs, governments release strategic reserves, and ordinary people discover that the price at the pump is connected to decisions made in places they may never visit. The hidden map becomes visible for a moment, but the deeper question remains. How did one resource become powerful enough to reshape economies, protect monarchies, provoke interventions, fund modernization, influence wars, and tie distant societies to the politics of the Gulf? How did the Middle East become not only a region with oil, but a central pressure point in the architecture of global power? To answer that, we have to look beneath the surface, not only at the wells, but at the system built around them. Because oil did not redraw the Middle East by itself. It did so through the invisible structure that formed around it, the dependence of the modern world on concentrated energy, extracted from specific places, moved through vulnerable routes, and controlled by whoever could combine geology, capital, technology, and force. The hidden force behind the oil map of the Middle East is not simply petroleum, it is concentrated energy dependency inside a fragile geography. Oil became powerful because it solved a problem that every industrial society faced: how to store, move, and release enormous amounts of energy with speed and flexibility. Coal had powered factories, railways, and empires, but oil gave the modern world something different. It was dense, transportable, adaptable, and perfectly suited for cars, trucks, tanks, ships, aircraft, plastics, chemicals, and global logistics. Once the 20th century began to run on liquid fuel, the places that held large, low-cost reserves became more than producers. They became strategic foundations of the modern economy. The Middle East mattered because its oil was not just abundant. In many fields, it was comparatively easy and inexpensive to extract. That changed the balance between geology and power. A barrel produced at low cost could influence global prices, corporate strategy, military planning, and national budgets. Countries with massive reserves did not need to manufacture the world's machines to become central to the world system. They needed to sit above the energy that those machines required. But ownership of oil underground was only one part of the story. Oil becomes power only when it can be discovered, extracted, financed, refined, transported, insured, sold, and protected. That means the true system is not a single well in the desert. It is an entire chain. Geological surveys, drilling technology, foreign concessions, state oil companies, export terminals, tanker fleets, refineries, banking systems, long-term contracts, naval routes, strategic reserves, futures markets. Every barrel that reaches a consumer has passed through a structure of engineering, law, money, diplomacy, and security. This is where the Middle East became a global pressure point. The region contains not only huge reserves, but also some of the most sensitive energy corridors on Earth. The Persian Gulf is not just a body of water, it is an artery. Tankers leave from terminals in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, then move through narrow passages where geography itself becomes leverage. The Strait of Hormuz is the most famous example, a narrow maritime choke point through which a significant share of the world's seaborne oil trade has moved. Its importance is not symbolic. If the flow is threatened, markets react because the world knows how much energy is concentrated behind that passage. A choke point changes the meaning of power. A country does not need to control the whole ocean to influence global anxiety. It only needs to sit near a point where movement can be delayed, threatened, or made more expensive. Insurance costs rise. Shipping routes are reassessed. Military patrols increase. Traders price in risk. Governments issue warnings. And consumers far away may eventually feel the pressure through fuel prices, inflation, and transportation costs. That is the hidden mechanism. Oil turned geography into a switchboard. Wells created wealth, But routes created vulnerability. Ports created access, but also exposure. Pipelines created alternatives, but also targets. Refineries created value, but also dependency. The more the global economy relied on Middle Eastern energy, the more every piece of infrastructure around that energy became strategic. For producer states, this created extraordinary opportunity. Oil revenues could finance state building at a speed that taxation alone could not achieve. Governments could build roads, hospitals, universities, ports, airports, desalination plants, power grids, and entire new cities. They could provide subsidies, public jobs, and welfare systems that strengthened domestic political arrangements. In some monarchies, oil helped transform ruling families from local authorities into managers of enormous national wealth. Their legitimacy was not based only on tradition. It was increasingly linked to distribution, jobs, benefits, stability, and development funded by petroleum income. But this opportunity came with a trap. When a state depends heavily on oil exports, its budget becomes exposed to prices it cannot fully control. A fall in oil prices can weaken public spending. A production disruption can threaten national revenue. A global recession can reduce demand. A technological transition can challenge the future value of reserves. Oil brings power, but it also creates dependence on the very system that gives that power meaning. For consuming countries, the dependency worked in the opposite direction. Industrial economies needed reliable energy, but many did not possess enough domestic oil to satisfy demand. Their vulnerability was not under the ground, it was in the supply chain. They needed access, predictable prices, open sea lanes, stable producer relationships, and enough spare capacity to absorb shocks. Energy security became a permanent concern of foreign policy. This is why oil never remained just a commodity. Wheat, copper, and iron matter deeply. But oil became something closer to a strategic bloodstream. If it stops moving, the effects spread fast. Trucks slow down. Ships become more expensive to operate. Airlines face rising fuel costs. Farmers pay more for diesel and fertilizer-linked inputs. Factories feel energy pressure. Households see inflation in places that seem unrelated to a distant oil field. The hidden force, then, is not the black liquid alone. It is the global architecture built around the need for that liquid to keep moving. The Middle East was redrawn because the world built a civilization that could not function without oil, then discovered that some of the most important oil sat beneath a region where geography, empire, monarchy, nationalism, foreign companies, military protection, and maritime chokepoints all converged. Oil made the Middle East powerful. Dependence made it unavoidable. Oil did not redraw the Middle East through geology alone. It did so through a network of interests that connected rulers, companies, foreign governments, military planners, workers, investors, consumers, and entire national economies. The wells were fixed in the ground, but the power around them moved through contracts, alliances, concessions, security guarantees, price negotiations, and infrastructure. To understand the oil map, we have to follow the relationships, not only the reserves. At the center of this network were the producing states. Some were monarchies of the Gulf, where oil revenues helped consolidate ruling systems, finance rapid modernization, and reduce the need for broad taxation. Others were republics with large populations, revolutionary movements, military institutions, or nationalist governments that saw oil as a tool for sovereignty. In each case, petroleum income became more than revenue. It became the foundation of state capacity. It paid for ministries, armies, roads, ports, subsidies, public salaries, housing programs, universities, and national development plans. But oil wealth did not affect every country in the same way. In small population Gulf states, large reserves could generate extraordinary per capita wealth. The state could become the main employer, investor, planner, and distributor of benefits. In larger countries, oil revenue could be powerful but insufficient to solve every social demand. It could finance infrastructure and military strength, but also intensify struggles over who controlled the state, who received benefits, and how wealth was distributed. Oil created resources, but also competition over the institutions that managed those resources. Then came the foreign companies. In the early oil age, many Middle Eastern reserves were explored and developed through concessions granted to outside firms. These companies brought capital, expertise, technology, and access to global markets. But they also created an imbalance. For decades, much of the pricing power, technical knowledge, and commercial control sat outside the producing countries. The oil was underground in the Middle East, but the decisions about investment, refining, shipping, and profit often involved boardrooms in distant capitals. This imbalance produced a long political struggle. Producing countries wanted greater control over their own resources. Foreign companies wanted stable contracts and predictable access. Consuming governments wanted secure supply. The result was not a single conspiracy, but a structural conflict of incentives. Every actor had a rational interest. Producers wanted sovereignty and revenue. Companies wanted profit and legal security. Consumers wanted affordable energy. Militaries wanted reliable fuel. Financial markets wanted predictability. But the same barrel could not satisfy all of them equally. The creation of OPEC was part of this larger shift. It was an attempt by oil-producing states to act collectively in a market where individual producers had often faced powerful companies and consuming countries alone. OPEC did not give its members absolute control over the world economy, and its influence has changed across decades. But it changed the psychology of oil politics. It showed that producers could organize, negotiate, and sometimes influence the terms of the system, rather than simply accept them. Outside powers became deeply involved because oil security became national security. For industrial economies, especially those dependent on imports, access to Middle Eastern energy was not a luxury. It was connected to transportation, manufacturing, military readiness, and social stability. This is why diplomatic relationships with oil-producing states often carried a strategic weight far beyond ordinary trade. Weapons sales, security guarantees, naval deployments, intelligence cooperation, and investment agreements became part of the same architecture. The protection of energy flows became one of the quiet foundations of international order. But there was another side of the network: the populations living inside oil economies. Citizens in producer states often benefited from public employment, subsidized fuel, electricity, water, education, healthcare, and infrastructure financed by petroleum income. Oil helped build modern cities and expand living standards with extraordinary speed. Yet it also created dependence on state distribution. When the state controls the main source of wealth, politics can revolve around access to that distribution. The social contract becomes different from countries where governments rely heavily on taxation. Instead of citizens financing the state distributes resource income to citizens. This arrangement can create stability, but also vulnerability. If oil prices fall, budgets tighten. If populations grow, benefits become more expensive. If young people need private sector jobs, oil revenue alone may not create enough productive employment. If the world moves toward lower carbon energy systems, governments must prepare for a future in which the old model may not generate the same power. This is why many Gulf states now speak about diversification, technology, tourism, logistics, finance, and renewable energy. They are not only branding themselves for the future, they are trying to escape the risk of depending too heavily on the resource that made them powerful. The network also includes workers who are often invisible in grand geopolitical narratives: ports, construction sites, refineries, pipelines, service industries, and megaprojects depend on labor, including millions of migrant workers in parts of the Gulf. Oil wealth built skylines, but skylines require human labor. Behind the image of wealth are logistics workers, engineers, drivers, technicians, cleaners, seafarers, and construction crews. Their lives reveal that the oil map is not only about states and corporations, it is also about people whose work keeps the system functioning. Consumers are part of the network too, even when they do not know it. A driver in Europe, a factory in Asia, an airline in Africa, a farmer in Latin America, and a shipping company crossing the Indian Ocean may all be indirectly connected to decisions made by producers, traders, refiners, and governments in the Middle East. The connection is not emotional or cultural, it is infrastructural. The price of oil travels through supply chains faster than most political ideas. It appears in freight rates, food prices, plastic products, chemical inputs, and inflation expectations. No actor fully controls this system. Producer states have reserves, but need buyers and stable demand. Consuming states have markets, but need supply. Companies have technology and logistics, but need access. Militaries can protect sea lanes, but cannot eliminate every risk. Investors can finance infrastructure, but cannot guarantee political stability. Citizens can benefit from oil wealth, but may also inherit its dependencies. This is the real network of interests, a web of mutual reliance where power is distributed unevenly, but vulnerability is shared. Oil redrew the Middle East because it made the region a meeting point of local sovereignty and global necessity. Every barrel carried more than energy. It carried contracts, security arrangements, political bargains, social expectations, corporate strategies, and international pressure. The map changed because everyone needed something from the same system, and no one could afford for that system to fail. The oil map of the Middle East was not created in one moment. It emerged slowly through discoveries, concessions, imperial calculations, wars, nationalizations, embargoes, revolutions, and security bargains. The turning point was not only the discovery of oil. It was the moment the world understood that control over oil could reshape political power. In the early 20th century, oil was becoming essential to modern warfare and industry. Navies were shifting from coal to oil. Armies were becoming mechanized. Cars, trucks, and aircraft were turning liquid fuel into a symbol of modern life. This changed how empires looked at territory. A desert with oil beneath it was no longer marginal. A coastline near oil routes was no longer peripheral. A local concession could become an imperial asset. Many of the first oil arrangements in the region were built through concessions granted to foreign companies. These agreements reflected the imbalance of their time. Local rulers often needed revenue, technical expertise, and political recognition. Foreign firms had capital, engineers, geologists, drilling equipment, and access to global markets. Imperial powers had diplomatic and military influence. Together, they created a system in which the resource was physically located in the Middle East, but much of the commercial and strategic control initially belonged elsewhere. This is one of the most important historical facts behind the modern region. Oil wealth began as a relationship of dependence before it became a tool of sovereignty. Producing territories had the resource, but not always the institutions, technology, or bargaining power to control the full chain. Foreign companies could extract, refine, market, and transport. Local governments could receive royalties, rents, and political support. But as oil revenues grew, so did the question of who should truly command the resource. The Second World War accelerated everything. Oil proved its strategic value on a global scale. Fuel-powered tanks, aircraft, ships, supply lines, and industrial production. After the war, the United States emerged with enormous power. Europe needed reconstruction, and global demand for energy expanded. The Middle East became central not only because of what had already been discovered, but because its reserves could help fuel the post-war order. Oil was no longer merely a commercial prize. It was a pillar of military planning, economic growth, and international influence. Then came nationalism. Across the region, governments and populations increasingly challenged the idea that foreign companies should dominate the wealth beneath local soil. The struggle took different forms in different countries, but the theme was consistent. Oil was becoming a symbol of independence. To control oil was to control the future of the state. To lose control was to remain economically dependent, even after formal political independence. This shift produced one of the great strategic transformations of the 20th century, the rise of state control over petroleum. Over time, producing countries renegotiated contracts, increased taxation, created national oil companies, and in some cases nationalized assets. The balance of power began to move away from the old concession system. The companies remained important, but governments became more assertive. Oil was being transformed from a foreign-managed business into a national instrument. The creation of OPEC in 1960 was a clear sign that this transformation had become collective. Founded in Baghdad by Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, OPEC gave producing states a platform to coordinate and defend their interests. It did not make them all powerful, and its members often had different agendas. But it marked a psychological break with the old order. Producers were no longer only territories where companies extracted oil. They were states trying to influence the rules of the global energy system. The most dramatic turning point came in the 1970s. The oil shocks of that decade revealed something the industrial world could no longer ignore. Energy dependency could become geopolitical vulnerability. When supply was restricted or prices surged, the effects were immediate and global. Economies slowed. Inflation rose. Consumers waited in fuel lines. Governments reconsidered strategic reserves, energy policy, alliances, and military commitments. Oil had always mattered, but now its political power was visible in everyday life. For the Middle East, the 1970s changed status into leverage. Producing states gained more revenue, more confidence, and more influence. Some used oil wealth to accelerate modernization. Others used it to strengthen military capacity, ideological projects, regional ambitions, or domestic control. Gulf monarchies in particular entered a new phase of state building, using petroleum income to construct infrastructure, expand public services, and invest globally. The image of the region changed, from deserts and imperial concessions to capitals of energy wealth. But leverage also attracted pressure. The more central Middle Eastern oil became, the more outside powers sought to secure access. The Persian Gulf became one of the most strategically monitored regions in the world. Sea lanes, tanker routes, terminals, and choke points were no longer just commercial infrastructure. They were part of the security architecture of the global economy. Foreign military presence, arms sales, defense partnerships, and diplomatic alignments all expanded around the need to keep oil flowing. The Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and repeated crises in the Gulf reinforced the same lesson. Political shocks in the region could become energy shocks for the world. Each crisis deepened the sense that the Middle East was not merely a producer region, but a central arena where local politics and global dependency collided. Energy security became inseparable from regional security. This is how oil redrew the map. Not by changing every border, but by changing the meaning of territory. A small state with export terminals could become strategically indispensable. A narrow strait could become a global anxiety point. A national oil company could become a pillar of state power. A monarchy could become a financial force. A revolution could move markets. A war could alter inflation in countries far away. The turning point then was the long transition from extraction to leverage. First, foreign companies and empires came for oil. Then producer states learned to command it. Then consumers realized they could not live without it. From that moment, the Middle East was no longer just a region on the map. It became one of the places where the modern world's dependence on energy was exposed. The real impact of Middle Eastern oil is not measured only in barrels, reserves, or government revenue. It is measured in the way a decision in one capital, a disruption at one port, a missile near one tanker route, or a production cut by one group of countries can travel through the global economy and reach ordinary life. Oil may begin underground, but its consequences appear everywhere. In the price of transportation, the cost of food, the stability of currencies, the budgets of governments, and the confidence of markets. This is why oil is different from many other commodities. It does not stay inside one industry. It moves through almost every industry. It fuels trucks that carry groceries to cities. It powers ships that move containers across oceans. It affects airlines, mining equipment, farm machinery, construction vehicles, military logistics, and emergency services. It is transformed into petrochemicals that appear in plastics, packaging, synthetic materials, medical equipment, fertilizers, and countless consumer goods. When oil becomes more expensive, the pressure does not remain at the fuel pump. It spreads. A household may never think about the Persian Gulf while buying bread, but energy is embedded in the journey of that bread. Fuel moves agricultural inputs. Fuel moves tractors. Fuel moves trucks. Fuel affects packaging. Fuel affects shipping. Fuel affects the electricity and heat used in parts of production and distribution. A shock in oil markets can therefore become part of food inflation, even if the connection is indirect. This is the hidden map entering the kitchen. Companies feel the pressure differently. Airlines face immediate fuel costs. Shipping firms adjust rates. Manufacturers pay more to move components. Retailers see logistics expenses rise. Farmers face higher diesel and input costs. Chemical companies respond to changes in feedstock prices. Some industries can pass the cost to consumers. Others absorb it and lose margins. The result is a chain reaction where a geopolitical event becomes a balance sheet problem for businesses far away from the region. Governments feel it as a political problem. Rising fuel prices can trigger public anger quickly because people experience them directly and repeatedly. Every trip to a gas station becomes a reminder of economic pressure. For countries that import most of their energy, higher oil prices can worsen trade balances, weaken currencies, and intensify inflation. Central banks may respond with tighter policy. Politicians may release strategic reserves, cut fuel taxes, increase subsidies, or search for new suppliers. A crisis in an oil-producing region can become a domestic political crisis in a consuming country. Inside the Middle East, the impact is even more structural. Oil revenue has shaped the social contract of many states. It has funded infrastructure, subsidized energy and water, expanded public employment, financed education, supported healthcare, and built cities in landscapes where rapid development would have been unimaginable without resource income. In some countries, oil gave the state the capacity to modernize without relying on the same tax structures seen elsewhere. That changed the relationship between government and society. But dependence works both ways. When oil prices are high, producer states may enjoy fiscal surpluses, ambitious construction, foreign investment, and greater diplomatic influence. When prices fall, budgets can tighten, projects can slow, and governments may face pressure to reform subsidies, diversify revenue, or create private sector jobs. The same resource that allows rapid development can also delay difficult economic transitions. Oil can buy time, but it cannot eliminate the need for a sustainable economy beyond oil. This is why diversification has become a strategic necessity, not just a slogan. Gulf states investing in logistics, tourism, finance, technology, renewable energy, sports, aviation, artificial intelligence, and manufacturing are trying to prepare for a future in which oil remains important but may not provide the same level of certainty. They know that reserves alone are not a strategy. The world is debating climate change, electric vehicles, renewable power, and the long-term reduction of fossil fuel dependence. Even if oil does not disappear quickly, its political meaning is changing. For countries with larger populations and fewer financial buffers, the challenge is sharper. Oil income can support the state, but it can also create vulnerability to corruption, inequality, underemployment, and fiscal instability. If too much of the economy revolves around extracting and distributing resource income, other sectors may struggle to become competitive. Young populations may demand jobs that oil revenues alone cannot provide. The pressure then becomes social as much as economic. The global security impact is equally important. Because oil routes matter, military strategy follows them. Naval patrols, bases, alliances, arms sales, air defense systems, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic mediation often exist in the shadow of energy security. The protection of tankers and terminals is not only about defending ships. It is about defending the flow of the global economy. A blocked choke point can affect not only the countries nearby, but also importers in Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. This is where a local failure can become a global shock. A refinery attack can move markets. A war near a shipping lane can raise insurance costs. A revolution can interrupt exports. Sanctions can redirect trade flows. A pipeline explosion can force buyers to search for alternatives. A production decision can influence inflation expectations. Oil connects local geography to global psychology. Markets often react not only to what has happened, but to what could happen next. Ordinary people rarely see this architecture. They see prices, they see inflation, they see government decisions, they see airlines charging more, groceries becoming more expensive, or fuel subsidies changing. But behind those visible effects is a hidden system of wells, routes, contracts, risks, and strategic choices. The Middle East matters to daily life, not because every consumer understands its politics, but because the modern economy still depends on energy flows that pass through the region. That is the real-world impact of oil's map. It turns distance into illusion. A tanker in the Gulf, a meeting of producers, a conflict near a terminal, or a policy shift in an exporting state can influence the cost of living thousands of kilometers away. Oil made the Middle East central not only to governments and corporations, but to commuters, farmers, factory workers, airline passengers, and families buying food. The resource beneath the desert became part of the price of modern life. Before we continue, if you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our world, subscribe to Hidden Power Map. And if this episode helps you see the world differently, leave a like. The story of oil in the Middle East is often told as a story of wealth. Wells were discovered, monarchies became rich, cities rose from the desert, and the world began watching the region with unusual intensity. But that is only the visible layer. The deeper story is not simply that the Middle East had oil. It is that the modern world became dependent on a form of energy that was concentrated in specific places, moved through vulnerable routes, and tied to the survival of industrial economies. That dependency changed everything. It changed how foreign powers looked at the region. Territories once treated as remote or secondary became strategic. Coastlines became essential. Ports became arteries. Desert fields became assets of global importance. Narrow waterways became points of fear for markets and governments. The map of the Middle East did not need to be redrawn only with new borders. It was redrawn through value. Places that had once seemed peripheral became central because the world's machines, armies, factories, ships, and cars needed what lay beneath them. Oil also changed the internal structure of states. It gave governments revenue on a scale that could build roads, ministries, airports, welfare systems, military forces, universities, and entire cities. In some countries, oil helped strengthen monarchies by giving rulers the capacity to distribute wealth and maintain stability without relying on broad taxation. In others, it became a symbol of sovereignty, nationalism, and control over the future. To command oil was not only to command revenue. It was to command development, diplomacy, and the ability to negotiate with powerful outsiders. But oil's gift always came with a condition. It created power and dependence at the same time. Producer states gained influence, but their budgets became exposed to prices, demand, and the long-term future of fossil fuels. Consuming states gained access to energy, but became vulnerable to disruptions, embargoes, wars, sanctions, and choke points. Companies gained profit, but depended on political access and stability. Consumers gained mobility and modern convenience, but became connected to distant events they could not control. This is the hidden force behind the whole story. Oil transformed geology into geopolitics. A substance buried underground became a system above ground. It became pipelines, ports, tankers, refineries, national oil companies, military bases, sovereign wealth funds, strategic reserves, subsidies, alliances, sanctions, and diplomatic bargains. It connected the worker filling a car with fuel to decisions made by ministries, producers, traders, naval commanders, and executives across the world. It made the Middle East not just a region with energy, but one of the main control panels of the global economy. And that is why oil redrew the map of the Middle East, not because it explained every conflict, every alliance, or every political decision. The region is far too complex for one explanation, but oil changed the weight of everything around it. It amplified rivalries. It attracted intervention. It strengthened some states and destabilized others. It turned local crises into global concerns. It made external powers more involved, regional governments more strategically important, and ordinary consumers more dependent on a system they rarely see. The 20th century was built on the assumption that oil would keep flowing, every day, through terminals, pipelines, tankers, and straits, from fields in the Gulf to refineries and markets across the planet. That assumption shaped foreign policy, military strategy, economic planning, urban life, agriculture, shipping, aviation, and the price of countless goods. The world did not only consume oil, it organized itself around oil. Now the map is changing again. The energy transition, electric vehicles, renewable power, climate pressure, and new technologies are challenging the old petroleum order. But the shift is not simple. Oil still moves the world in ways that are difficult to replace quickly. Petrochemicals, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, military logistics, and global trade remain deeply linked to fossil fuels. The future may reduce oil's dominance, but it has not yet erased the structures oil created. For the Middle East, this creates a new strategic question. How does a region whose modern power was shaped by petroleum prepare for a world trying to use less of it? Some states are investing in finance, tourism, logistics, artificial intelligence, sports, manufacturing, and renewable energy. Others face harder transitions with larger populations, tighter budgets, or fewer alternatives. The same resource that built influence now forces a race against time. The hidden map is still there. It is visible in shipping lanes, military partnerships, investment funds, oil price shocks, refinery networks, and the diplomatic importance of the Gulf. But it is also visible in something more ordinary, the cost of moving people and goods. Every time fuel prices rise after a crisis, every time inflation responds to energy costs, every time governments worry about a blocked strait, the old map drawn by oil appears again. So the answer to the opening question is clear. Oil redrew the map of the Middle East because it turned underground reserves into global leverage. It transformed local geology into international power, state revenue into political stability, maritime routes into strategic choke points, and energy dependence into a permanent feature of world affairs. The black liquid beneath the sand did not simply fuel engines. It fueled alliances, interventions, modernization, vulnerability, and influence. It made the Middle East unavoidable. And if one resource could reshape an entire region and tie its fate to the daily life of billions, what other hidden systems are quietly shaping the world right now? If the age of oil is slowly changing, who will gain power from the next energy map? And when the world says it wants to leave oil behind, how much of the old map will still remain beneath the surface?